Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm back with the next chapter of this book collecting game by A. Edward Newton. I apologize for missing yesterday. I'm just going to go ahead and post this today. Big changes at work this week, getting resituated, and lots of noise coming from the construction site next door as well, which just made it not suitable conditions for filming the next chapter here. So this chapter is called Conversation in the Library at Oak Knoll. Guest: This is a nice room. I have heard that you have some fine books. Let's talk about them. Host: Are you a collector? Guest: Not in the least, but I am fond of reading. Why do you ask? Host: Because when a collector begins to talk books with one who is not, he is in a fair way to become a bore. I am willing to talk either to a collector or to a reader, but I like to know which one I am talking to before I begin. Cannot one be both? Says the guest. Host: Certainly, I am both myself. Guest: You write too, I have heard. Host: Yes, occasionally, not too much, I hope. Guest: Have you ever written anything about George Moore? Host: I don't think I ever have. It is always dangerous for a man to write about a living author. The writer is usually unimportant and seeks by his writing to make the acquaintance of the author. It's a great mistake. Guest: What's your opinion of George Moore? I see you have a lot of first editions here. Host: Yes, and over there is another lot, all presentation copies. I've been collecting him for 30 years. He is, in my judgment, capable of writing finer English than any man now living. A little steadied, perhaps, but a great artist. We have had few greater. I wish I could admire the man as I do his work. Guest: What's wrong with the man? Host: Oh, I don't know. I never heard a man in London speak well of him. Guest: And a woman? Host: I never heard a woman speak of him at all, personally. They say that he kisses and tells. Guest: That's rotten, of course. Who do you mean by they? Host: The men I have talked to about him. Guest: What do you think of his poetry? Host: I don't think much of it, nor does he, I believe. I read somewhere the other day that when he discovered that his poetry was bad, he was very disconcerted and gave up writing and went to Paris to study art. Then he saw that his pictures were worse than his poetry, and he gave them up and returned to prose, which is undoubtedly his proper métier. Guest: What did you pay for Flowers of Passion? Host: I don't remember. I bought it years ago. Here is a nice pagan poem that has the errata slip, and look at the title page. To Oscar Wilde with the author's compliments, G.M. Guest: Not bad. Host: I should say not. Speaking of poetry, Moore says somewhere that George Meredith was no novelist, but will be remembered by his verse. It may be that Meredith's novels will be forgotten and that his verse will live, but I don't think so. Guest: What was the first novel of Moore's that you read? Host: Evelyn Innes, which Jim Huneker says is the best musical novel ever written. I know what he means, of course, but I wonder whether that is the way to describe a novel. The question is it a good novel? I read Evelyn when it first came out and greatly enjoyed it. It may not be in the same class with The Mummer's Wife or Esther Waters, which are indeed first-rate, but the English circulating libraries would not allow either of them on their shelves, which was silly, for unpleasant as they undoubtedly are, they are not vicious. It would be just as reasonable to condemn a hospital because diseases are studied there and relieved, as it is to object to a book because it is unpleasant. If these books have a tendency, it is a good one. Guest: He was much attacked once. Host: Yes, and he fought back and won. He's a born fighter, like all Irishmen, and neither gives nor asks for a quarter. The trouble really began with A Modern Lover, a 3-volume novel published by Old Tinsley in 1883. It met with the approval of the reviews like the Athenaeum and the Spectator, but an old lady wrote to William Mudie of the Lending Library in Oxford Street and protested against his circulating the book. People then did not buy novels, they just got them from the libraries, and these, becoming rich and powerful, finally came to dictate as to what should and should not be published. They had no objection to sin. On the contrary, they rather liked it. But the sinner had to be a lady. George Moore's sinners were common people, as Zola's were, and he had to be suppressed. It is difficult to suppress an Irishman, and Zola, the prototype of all that was dreadful in English eyes, lived in Paris beyond the reach of English law, but his publisher could be arrested and was. Guest: You don't say. Host: Yes, a vigilant society was formed to guard the morals of the public, and Henry Vitelli, an old man of 73, was arrested. It was with difficulty that he got a lawyer to defend him. Finally, he was tried, convicted, and cast into Holloway Gaol, the establishment patronized by Oscar Wilde, and to add to the absurdity, shortly after the prosecution of Vitelli by the Attorney General one administration, Zola, whose disciple George Moore was, came to England and was publicly welcomed by the Attorney General of another administration, at a dinner attended by the most distinguished literary men of the time. Meanwhile, old Vitelli died of a broken heart. Guest: Well, I'll be. Host: Sure you will. It is often said that nature disregards the individual, that nature is cruel, and the like, but society is equally cruel and ridiculous, which nature never is. Here was an old man done to death by the British public in what Macaulay called one of its periodic fits of morality. Nowadays we let authors run amok and content ourselves with attacking clergymen who use their minds. Guest: The crowd is always ridiculous. Host: Always. Moore, the English Zola as he was called, was in the thick of the fight. The other day, in one of James F. Drake's catalogs, I saw a book priced at $75 that I bought when it came out in 1883 for 10 shillings. Here it is. It consists of extracts from all the great English classics, showing that the legal suppression of Zola's novels would logically involve the bowdlerizing of some of the greatest works in English literature. The letter to the Solicitor of the Treasury, although it is signed by Vitelli, is generally supposed to have been written by G.M. Guest: Who selected the extracts? Host: It was always said that G.M. did. He would know how. Guest: I never saw it before. Host: This is the only copy I have seen in years. The letter to the solicitor is not a part of the book, but when you buy the book, you want the letter. What do I think of Moore's later books? Well, since the Memoirs of My Dead Life, which is beautifully written but is as inflammable as gun cotton in the expurgated edition, I have only read 3: The Brook, Kerith and Avowals, and A Storyteller's Holiday. By the way, did you ever hear the story of the publication by Appleton of the American edition of the Memoirs of My Dead Life? I never have. A set of the English sheets came in the post one day, and Mr. Appleton handed them to his secretary, a very demure young lady. There were such 20 years ago, saying, "Take this home and read it and let me know what you think. I've agreed to take it." A day or two later, the girl came back, and when asked her opinion, gave it briefly. "I think if you publish it, you'll go to jail," she replied. "As bad as that, eh?" said Mr. Appleton, who valued his liberty more than George Moore's good opinion. So the edition he published was very rigidly expurgated. Guest: I suppose that is why the first English edition is worth $30, and the first New York edition 30 cents? Host: That holds good of any American reprint of an English book. It is always best to pay $1 or $2 more in the first place and get a first English edition. A woman, it was probably a woman who dropped into Dutton's in the autumn of 1924 and got a first English edition of When We Were Very Young by Milne, was handsomely rewarded. Guest: How is that? Host: It's worth about $40 today. The reprint, published by Dutton, is worthless from a collector's point of view. But we were talking about George Moore. Guest: What do you think of The Brook, Kerith? Host: It is a marvelous book, a dignified treatment of the life of Christ. At first it seems a little strange, but that is not due to any flippancy on the part of the author, but to the fact that we are chiefly used to the story of Christ in one setting only. It shows great power and could only have been written after an immense amount of study. It is a tour de force in style. It is almost impossible to believe that from one and the same pen came books so different as the Memoirs of My Dead Life and The Brook, Kerith. Now, if Thomas Hardy had had the inspiration to write a book about the life of Christ rather than Moore, we should have had the greatest piece of pessimism in any language. Guest: You rank Hardy above Moore. Host: Yes, they will hardly plant George Moore in the Abbey or Shaw either. We have only 3 great writers left today: Kipling, Moore, and Shaw. Shaw gives me the most pleasure, but Kipling is as sure of the Abbey as any living man can be. He is the real poet laureate of the British Empire, but how he hates Americans. Guest: Why do you suppose? Host: Well, we are a bumpetous people for one reason, and the other is that we shall never again play second fiddle to the English. No Englishman can be expected to forgive us that. Guest: What do you think of Galsworthy? Host: I had forgotten Galsworthy for the moment. He is a sort of cross between Thackeray and Trollope. I think the Forsyth saga, beginning with The Man of Property, the most important novel or series of novels that has appeared since Hardy wrote his last novel, Jude the Obscure. Perhaps I should include some novel by Conrad, but he is an author I could never read. Guest: Not Lord Jim? No, none of them. You must be deficient. Have you read Ave? Host: No, I haven't read Abe or Selb or Vale. I tried to and couldn't with pleasure, so I quit. Avowals is another matter. Every admirer of Moore will wish to own it, but I resent its format. I don't think it quite fair for an author to throw over his public and his publisher and bring out books privately at a price that many of his lifelong admirers cannot afford to pay. Guest: Why did he do it? Host: To make money, of course. The British author is about the most mercenary male animal existing. The best defense is an attack. To conceal this trait in himself and having the ear of the public, he accuses us of being a nation of dollar chasers, and we sit patiently under the accusation. Guest: You don't seem to. Host: I know that it is not true. We are the only people that have any disinterested ideals. Look at our treatment of Cuba. The English always look out for number one. Guest: You know I'm English. Host: Yes, and you know how true what I'm saying is. But we were talking of George Moore, who is Irish. When he was asked why he published in the manner he does now, he said, I know that by publishing as I do, I have cut myself off from many readers, but no publisher would take the risk of printing what I write, and the alternative is to stop writing. That is sheer nonsense. He publishes as he does because he wants both the author's and the publisher's profits. He is always fussing with his books, and it is quite likely that after he has exploited the $15 market, he will finally yield to pressure and bring out his books in cheap editions. He smashed the expensive novel once, and he may do it again. He had the intelligence and courage and persistence to smash the old three-decker, and now he is secure of his public. He tumbles out clumsy, expensive books, obviously written for money, well-corrected proof sheets and suppressed chapters and galley proofs are to be found on every dealer's shelves. And it looks like sucker bait, if you ask me. I leave those ugly George Moore books to others. Guest: But you have Avowals. Host: Yes, and I've read it, but it is badly printed on heavy, stiff paper. It is hard to hold, and owing to the nature of the book and the absence of quotation marks, is difficult to read. Listen to his dialogue between Moore and Edmund Gosse. Gosse: Have you read The Scarlet Letter? Moore: No, and I never shall. The subject is too painful. Surely the creator of Kate Lennox ought not to balk at Hester Prynne. But it is interesting to learn his opinions, and of course he is quite right when he says that the genius of the English people expresses itself in poetry, as Germany expresses herself in music, and France and Italy in plastic arts. It is, however, disconcerting to a man who knows but one literature, and is not very strong on poetry, to be told that his favorite writers cannot write prose. To be sure, Moore excerpts the essayists, for which I am indeed thankful, as I am to find that Defoe was inspired at least near the first half of Robinson Crusoe. But there is, I fancy, a great deal of truth to his remark that in the parlance of the racing stable, English fiction is hackney. French and Russian narrative shows more breeding. Guest: What do you think of the Russians? Host: They are only names to me. Their novels are interminably long and very gloomy. Here is an excellent little volume called Aspects of the Novel. It is a series of lectures, or talks rather, given by a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. Listen to what he says. No English novelist has explored man's soul as deeply as Dostoevsky, and no novelist anywhere has analyzed the modern consciousness as successfully as Marcel Proust. Before these triumphs we must pause. English poetry fears no one, excels in quality as well as quantity. But English fiction is less triumphant. It does not contain the best stuff yet written. And if we deny this, we become guilty of provincialism. Guest: Not very encouraging. Host: Not very, but English fiction is good enough for me. I don't want to explore the soul of a man or a woman whose name I can't pronounce. I read for pleasure, not to become involved in the modern consciousness, whatever that may mean. Let's get back to George Moore. Guest: I liked Avowals. Host: So did I, enormously. One would have to go far to find more delicious prose than Moore's in this same volume. His description of his visit to Paris, seeking in vain for the warmth and movement and colour of his life there in the 70s and 80s, is exquisite. If he is right in saying that language is a piano on which Thackeray performs with the grace and skill of the trained artist, and on which Dickens plays so brilliantly, if somewhat boisterously by ear, striking now and then a false note, which we forgive on account of his genius. With equal truth, may it not be said that George Moore uses it like the violin, and that his technique is almost faultless? Guest: what do you think of his essays? Host: excellent. That man has great knowledge, the gift of a fine style, which he has improved, and the greater gift of humor. One of his papers is so amusing that I never tire of it. Guest: what is it? Host: Royalty in Art, in the volume called Modern Painting. Don't you know it? It is a sheer delight. I have read it aloud 20 times. Here is a curious volume. Look at the title page. Guest: I see. It is presented to Henley. Host: yes, but the title page reads Impressions and Opinions by George Moore, author of A Humorous Wife instead of A Mummer's Wife. And here we have that title page just described. I think it is a copy rushed through the press and hastily bound and sent to Henley to review. Guest: why hastily bound? Host: because on the spine is merely the word essays. It should of course be Impressions and Opinions. Guest: are there many copies like this? Host: no one knows how many. I should have said that it is unique, but in my experience, the moment a man thinks he has a unique book, another copy turns up, sometimes several copies. Guest: isn't that a picture of him? Host: yes, Rosie gave it to me, and just alongside of it is a superb photograph of Whitman, of whom I should be glad to have Moore's opinion. And here is the George Moore photograph just mentioned. Host: I haven't the least idea. All I know is that the inscription reads, To the Moore Literary Circle with greetings, the salutation of me, George, with mine own hand. I don't know where Rosie got it. Guest: how old is he? Host: I have been told that he is 75. His age is not given in Who's Who. He conceals it as carefully as a prima donna. Guest: isn't it given in that book about him by John Freeman? Host: I don't know. I have never read it, and I never shall. One can discover all one wants to know about George Moore in his books, whereas Dr. Johnson says the best part of every author is to be found. And here we have a photograph of George Moore 40 years ago. And that brings us to the end of this chapter titled Conversation in the Library at Oak Knoll. And the next chapter will be Humor and Pathos of Dr. Johnson's Dictionary.